So I finished the story of Guild Wars 2 this last week for the base game, the A Realm Reborn equivalent. And honestly, it's not that different in the amount of story it's going to tell, but it tells it in a much denser way. And I want to put it in Final Fantasy terms because a lot of times in the community I hear people say Heavensward is so much better. But like usually people mean like I like the story of A Realm Reborn, I just think the game gets better at telling story. Because I think A Realm Reborn does not necessarily do the best theoretical possible job of telling A Realm Reborn. As opposed to Endwalker, it would be hard to think of a book doing it better, because there's things about it that just have to be gameplay. It would be hard to think of a movie doing it better, because shortening it would really leave out a lot. And so like as you think of different formats, how else could you tell the story of Endwalker where it's better than Endwalker? Endwalker kind of nails it. And A Realm Reborn, you're kind of left thinking, the source material appears really good. The people who worked on this appear to be passionate and care for it. But I just don't know that even if we just gave those people another chance at this, I think there's possibly better execution through A Realm Reborn. Next week, I'll be finishing up A Realm Reborn myself, doing 2.5, 2.55, and coils, as well as I'm trying to finish up some class quests. But I've done 2.4, I've done Crystal Tower, and that's where I'm at. And I want to compare it base 2.0 with base Tyria, because I haven't done the living seasons yet, and so it is just base expansion to base expansion. Now, I'm going to use all Final Fantasy terms here, so this might come across as Final Fantasy spoilery, but it should leave you pretty safe for playing Guild Wars. All of this is included in their base game being for free if you want to go give it a shot. First of all, the main story is not required. What you do instead is you are basically immediately in a new game plus type thing. So you open up a menu and you go over here and it's broken into chapters. They break it down by the different expansions, and actually the patch content falls into what's called living seasons because it's not a subscription based game, so ownership of content works a little bit differently. So you end up with these kind of chapters. Now the base game can only be played through one time, but the other things function just like New Game Plus, where you can play through the living seasons over and over, and there's actually some incentivization to do so, because my understanding is there's some achievements. I don't totally understand it yet because I haven't gone through it, but the base expansion is a one-time thing, and the reason for that is that there's actual agency. In A Realm Reborn, this is going to be the same experience for you as it is for me. Whether you did this back in A Realm Reborn or you do it now, it's largely the same thing. They've adjusted the number of quests over the years, they've redone some of the dungeons over the years, but largely they are trying to tell the same story. They've just adjusted it for time by like scaling up experience, cutting some frivolous quests, and so on. But largely, you don't have any agency. There's nothing about it where if you cleared it 5 years ago, you got to go left, and I now have to go right. There's nothing about it where you get to choose left or right. But in Guild Wars, it works a little bit differently. First of all, your character creation matters. In Final Fantasy, we choose things like base attributes. We choose a guardian and things like that, and a name day, a birthday. In Guild Wars, you don't do that. In Guild Wars, and it doesn't mean anything. In Guild Wars, you choose that, and it matters. As you play through A Realm Reborn, that's going to determine various flavor texts. My understanding is it's not wildly different, but it is part of it. The next thing you choose that's very important is you choose a race. I am a female Makote, and that doesn't determine my starting city. In A Realm Reborn, my base class. So I started the game as a thaumaturge, so I started in Ul'dah, becomes Black Mage, as opposed to I started my story character as a warrior, and so my Marauder started out in Limsa Lominsa. It doesn't matter what race I picked. But imagine for a second if the game actually gave us more location lore by starting certain races in certain racially appropriate areas. What that would look like, for example, is we would give Lalafels would all start in Ul'dah, regardless of base class. We would have Makote start in, let's say, Corvos, which is not even a zone available in game, but let's just assume that that's a logical place for them to start. Elizant would start in Gridania, and maybe Hrothgar would start in, I don't even know where they come from. Let's say Mercidia, and so on. We would continue down that line of thought. So that gives you an opportunity to take the starting race and say, I want to define this area through the locals. And what that means is, unlike WoW, where you just do the base starting zone and get released out very, very quickly, they actually dwell on this. And so you go to level 30 of 80, kind of in this, like, racial quest line. So instead of level 15 going and visiting the other city-states, what if we had to put down that city-state's respective primal before going and meeting up with the Scions of the Seventh Dawn? Imagine if for a moment we got to really dwell and be involved in that. And so it feels really significant, because unlike WoW, where it just kind of introduces you in a starting zone, so it's mostly teaching you how to play, it actually extends well beyond that. Now, one of the things that Guild Wars does not do is force you to do the dungeons. And so in Final Fantasy, where you would actually go ahead and run Sistasha and Copperbell, Toto Rock, Hawk Manor, and all these. Some of these are optional dungeons, some are not. In Guild Wars, they are all optional. And so what the dungeons ends up doing, from what I've been told, is I haven't cleared any of the dungeons narratively yet. I've done a couple for just gameplay, but I did it before I did the story, so I don't know what all it was telling me. That's where they introduce you to everybody else, because one of the problems is if we move to not going beyond our city-state until we had our Jobstone, is you would show up at the Scions, and there really isn't time to introduce you to the Scions that were not in your initial starting zone. And so if you started in Limsa Lamensa, for example, you would meet Y'shtola very early on, but you would really have no idea who Thancred, Papalima, or Yida are, because they start somewhere else. And so you might instead say, okay, all characters have the chance to run Sistasha. Sistasha takes place in Lenosha, and you run Sistasha with Y'shtola. Now, the people who start in Limsa, that doesn't really introduce new information, it's just extension on the person you already care for. However, when you get to Copperbell Mines, you would run that with Thancred, and all of a sudden you would be like, oh, who is Thancred? Interesting. This is my chance to meet Thancred. And then when we go to do Toto Rock, that would take place in Gridania, and so you might run it with Yida and Papalimo, and so that would introduce you to those characters. And so by skipping those on my initial playthrough, I met them for the first time, and it was basically like in the middle of conversation. So you just like go on this quest with the Scions, they're like, yeah, Thancred's gonna go with you. He's like, cool, let's go. You're like, who are you? So you're a little bit lost. Now, beyond that, they do still have grand companies. They are the Vigil, the Priory, and the Whisperers or whatever. And they have these grand companies. You do choose one. And in A Realm Reborn, when you chose your grand company, it not only determined your hunt log and like how you did all these various things yourself, but it also limited who you PvP'd with. It no longer does. So grand company has become more and more superficial over the years. But in Guild Wars, your grand company is a significant narrative driver. These grand companies each have a different way of doing things and lend different strengths to the main scenario. So what ends up happening is you kind of go back to your grand company hall. Instead of operating out of the Waking Sands, you operate out of your grand company location. And so that's where you go back to. So I've only played through on the Vigil, but I think there are going to be moments that would feel different. My story character on Final Fantasy is Maelstrom. So I go back to Limsa, and I identify with Limsa because that was my starting city as well. But, like, I also go back there because that's where the Maelstrom is. And that's a really significant thing in Guild Wars, as opposed to grand companies don't really feel that way. And so you would have probably a much different relationship if every time you went back to be caught up on events, that was always done from Morwib versus always being done, you know, from like Raubon. So that's part of it. And then as you're going through story, one of the problems that I struggle with in Final Fantasy is it feels like you have to solve everything the way the game expects you to. So for example, everybody knows that I hate copper bell mines. Anybody who's been around the channel for a while knows that my go-to complaint is that my character was forced to take part in copper bell mines. Imagine if we had had a choice to either run copper bell mines for the purpose of liberating the slaves there or putting down the slave rebellion. Now, the game forces us to put down the slave rebellion. I disagree with that ethically, and I don't like that the game makes me do it. And I would then have to choose. So not only do we have different objectives and different base points of presenting things and a different tone on the world because of this different starting zone, but we literally have different choices throughout the story. Now, those choices all collapse, and so post Copper Bell Mines, we end up in the same spot so that we can re-merge with the story. But basically, throughout the story, there are various chapters that split into 2 or 3 areas and then re-merge down. They end up in the same spot. They end up in a Praetorium-style dungeon at the finale of the expansion that is honestly like the old Praetorium dungeon, where it just is a combination of bad pacing, bad game mechanics, poor aging, and it's just terrible. It's terrible. The Praetorium experience was pitiful back in the day, but narratively it was this huge moment. This enormous moment. And the final moments of Tyria are this enormous moment that we have built up to, and we have gone and solved all these various, like, just these, like, MacGuffin style problems. We've gone and we've said, like, we can't take them on unless this was going on. And then we went and solved that, and we solved this. And so you've just built this up, and each time you're solving one of those things, you're learning about the fallout that this final conflict could cause. You're learning about what's at stake. And then you just have this terrible dungeon that narratively is amazing. My first time through A Realm Reborn, I did it post Endwalker. My first time to really be paying attention in Praetorium. I tried getting there post Shadowbringers launch, and I didn't really quite get there. And so to be invested like this, I already knew what the dungeon was. I had run MSQ Roulette 1,000 times. So I was there only for narrative, and so I really enjoyed it. Praetorium's since been redone into a much better dungeon, and I think that the final instance of Guild Wars, instead of adding a duty support system, what they did is they turned it into a single-player scenario, but it still feels like the other players should be there. They just aren't. So it just doesn't feel good. I think it needs to be redone. I think it needs to honestly be redone into something that better represents what Guild Wars is. But what I thought was exciting about this is the concept of how would you redo A Realm Reborn if you were truly from the ground up going to remake it? Would you just turn it into a movie and you do the whole thing in 2 or 3 hours? Obviously, to cut down what is likely 30 or 40 hours of story that is nested within what could easily be 100 or 200 hour gameplay experience if you start doing side stories and you level up things and you go get invested in beast tribes and stuff like that. Would you try to sum all that up in 2 or 3 hours? Would you break that into a television show where it's a 13 or 22 episode series at 20 or 30 minutes apiece? And so now you've got a lot more time to kind of flesh a lot of this out. Is it instead just redone as a gameplay experience? Because there is something special about video games in that you get to really fight a primal. But if so, do you instead break it into having choices? Even though, obviously, we still need to end at Praetorium. We still need to end wherever 2.5 gets. We still need to... The primals still have to get fought, because as a gameplay experience, we have to continue justifying that 8 people are in there and none of them are trying to, like, let the primal live. So we need all 8 people to agree that in a primal fight, our goal is to kill the primal. But maybe some people are there to kill it more begrudgingly. Maybe some people are there to kill it more scientifically. Maybe some people are there just for the glory and the slaughter. And maybe some people want to serve those beast tribes coming off that primal, as opposed to others feel that they've served the primal, they have a death sentence, and we should put them down. And so I think that building into the primal and coming out of the primal, there's some opportunities there. As we explore both the optional and mandatory dungeons, Aurum Vale is not required. So when people wonder why it isn't supported by duty support, Dazmel Darkhold, Cutter's Cry, Temple of Karn, these are not Halatali. These are not required dungeons to be unlocked on your character ever. Ever. Aurum Vale is not an experience that a new player ever has to have. And so how does that work? Because as I look at presenting this, the way that we've chosen to document my experience in Final Fantasy XIV is it's over on Gaming Lore kinda. I voiced every character, sorry. So in the majority of cutscenes where it's non-voiced, it's my voices. And we cut that down into 20 or 30 minute episodes, and you end up with like 60 or so for the MSQ, but there's a bunch of side stuff that I did as well. Coils will be on there. Crystal Tower, I think, has just finished, or is just getting going. And so there's this story to be shared over there. But with Guild Wars, it feels more like a Bandersnatch, which is Netflix kind of choose your own adventure shows. So something like a Goosebumps or something like that, where you get to the end of a chapter and it says, if you want to save this person, flip to page 42. If you feel that they should die, flip to page 64. And it feels much closer to that. And so I think that there's aspects of A Realm Reborn that I wish was told more in the way Guild Wars told it. But there's also an element of Guild Wars where I realize it is more than possible that even among the community members that choose to do story, because you do not have to. You don't even have to skip story. You do not have to do story in Guild Wars. Even of the people that choose to do it, there's probably still a lot of people who don't get all of it because they do it one time and they don't want to go back and do it a second time for minor differences. So they don't do it on a different race. They don't do it and choose something different. And so how many things are locked away by this method that I do think is probably more immersive? I just thought that was kind of an interesting way of looking at it. I think a lot about getting to know World of Warcraft lore has just shown me that Final Fantasy is just better at telling story. There's really not as much to be learned from it. But I think from Guild Wars it says, what if we just viewed it differently? I don't know that it's better. What if it was just different? As far as things that I think that in ARR, I'm more attached to the music from the get-go in Final Fantasy. Not that Guild Wars doesn't have good music. And the voice acting in Guild Wars is just top tier. Absolutely incredible. The pacing and the combat, it's hard to compare them. They both come at things so differently, and knowing that I am now max level for the game coming out of the Guild Wars base game, as opposed to Final Fantasy, I don't even have all the classes unlocked yet, much less am I anywhere close to max level. So like, there's so much about the way the loot is distributed and all that that's just honestly apples and oranges. But I think narratively, they both told an incredibly dense, large-scale, significant story that I've been told over and over by their respective community gets better. And if you liked this, just wait till you get to the good stuff. But I actually really enjoyed all the way through and feel that both were probably underserved by what their end instance was and what it aged into being. Final Fantasy having just replaced theirs relatively recently, and I think it's a massive improvement within the spectrum of like what can be done affordably. I would love to see Guild Wars make that same Exile's Reach, New Praetorium style rehash of their final instance, because otherwise I really like it. I really enjoyed the Guild Wars expansion. I just think that what could it have been better at? What could we learn from it as Final Fantasy fans, as far as if there ever was a Realm remastered, if there ever was this kind of a Realm remade type experience, what would you want that to look like? How different from it? Would you rather them just redo it with more voice acting and more dense writing, and stronger representations of what gameplay is now with things like tank buster markers and things like that, the Praetorium style experience with better voice acting? Or would you rather them come at it from a totally different angle, either by putting it on a different platform as a movie or something like that, or redoing the game? And if so, like, how different would you want it to be Or is it effectively just the same thing, but better, kinda?